Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. I want to welcome all of you back to Ohio Exopolitics. I'm your host, Mark Snyder. We're back in the Billy Meyer case, and we are going to be talking first this evening about Contact Report 150, which took place right around 1981, and Billy's contact person during this contact was a man named Quetzal. Quetzal was 376 years old in 2007. He's 1.9 meters tall, which is about 6.25 feet tall. He has blue-gray eyes, light brown hair. He's the father of 6 children. And during the 11-year contact period between 1975 and 1986, Quetzal was the commander of all the Plejaren stations in our solar system. According to Edward Albert Meyer, Quetzal possesses enormous abilities in the field of technology. He is also quite distinguished in terms of being an inventor who has invented and constructed several useful devices for Billy and for the Figu, which have been very useful in helping them fulfill their mission. So I'll jump right in here and Contact Report 150, which is huge, by the way. If you look that up on the Future Mankind site, it's very massive. It's quite a big contact. I'm going to start with line 150, right around 158, 157, because before that they were kind of discussing some group issues, some mundane kind of things that it just really wasn't all that interesting. I'll let you read it for yourself. So Billy says, "That is clear to me, but since we are already talking about celestial bodies, I still have another question concerning Saturn. As it is known to you, the American space probe Voyager travels past Saturn and sends recorded images to the Earth. To my knowledge, it has been argued until now that Saturn only has 10 or 11 moons. Although it is true that there are 29, if I omit the Adoniden, now it would interest me whether all these moons will be discovered by picture transmissions of probes, etc." So the first thing Billy is talking about are these celestial bodies like Saturn. A celestial body is something that's visible in the sky or in the heavens or in the universe beyond the Earth's atmosphere. Saturn is the 6th planet in order from the Sun. It is the 2nd largest planet in the solar system. It is encompassed by a series of thin flat rings composed of small particles of ice. It's a gas giant with an average radius about 9 times that of the Earth. The Voyager program that Billy's talking about, again, the Voyager is a American space probe. There are actually 2 of them, and the United States launched 2 unmanned space missions, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. These were launched in 1977, and they launched it then because there was a favorable alignment of all the planets in the late 1970s. So they could study these planets because they were all lined up. They could make one pass out of the solar system. The goal was to study Jupiter and Saturn, but these space probes have continued on, and they're still sending data back as far as I know. Now, Billy said something interesting. At the time of the contact, the world thought there were only 10 or 12 moons around Saturn. The Plejaren say there are 29. Now, today, we think there are 62, but all of these other things that we're calling moons now are just fragments and not actually moons. They're smaller fragments of the planet Malona. Oh, by the way, I'll try to keep my eyes peeled. If you hear any more problems with audio, let me know, and I'll try to do something about it. I need to put a call in the blog talk and find out what's going on there. Could be just bad connection on my side. And Quetzal answers Billy. Quetzal says, "It will be so and still more. As you already could conclude by yourself on your great voyage." Okay, let me explain. I think it's Contact 31, where Billy had the trip on the great mothership, where he went with Semjase into the mothership, and they were in Semjase's beam ship. They actually traveled inside the great mothership. And the mothership's an awesome thing. It's like 10 miles wide, and it's higher than the largest mountains on the earth. And it has a whole ecosystem inside it, including plants and animals and rolling hills and water. It's just an amazing thing. So they're referring to his great voyage. He was actually on that mothership. They left our solar system, and it's quite a story. Maybe we'll get back to it one day. Quetzal says, as you already could conclude by yourself on your great voyage at the place and location, there revolve around Saturn 29 moons that are actually to be beholded as such. They are expected to be discovered in their entire number approximately 25 years from the time of this contact by probes and telescopes. But in truth, there aren't any more. So many that can still be discovered up to this number, because since your journey is Saturn, Earth scientists have discovered a few more moons, but which apparently slipped past you during the last few years. After the discovery of the moons around Jupiter, scientists now reckon that they will also still find some undiscovered satellites around Saturn. And there will be a surprise for them there. So, we just are going to introduce Contact Report 150 this evening. It has a lot of intersections, particularly with the Goblet of Truth, which kind of amazed me. I printed this out and I'm starting to read it. It also talks about the Pope and some of the machinations revolving the Pope at this time. Okay, I'll read this quickly. Toward the end of April or the beginning of May, the Pope of Rome will again dissipate the monies of his believers, because once again he will begin an extremely expensive trip to countries that will cost millions of dollars. This is down in line 173. He will visit Portugal, where he will hypocritically let it be announced that the Madonna of Fatima had protected him, helping him survive the assassination attempt that had been made on his life. Well, there was a Catholic priest of a slight different faith that wanted to kill him, who had a dagger, who in this murder was thwarted by some security folks. So that's the story where that is concerned. So Billy got the prophecy about that. Now it's interesting thing what Billy had to say about this Pope. Again, this is in 1981. I don't know off the top of my head which Pope this was. I probably should look it up. Billy says, I think that the present Pope is disgust, inciting, mendacious, hypocritical, one who deliberately misleads the people, and he is a totifying pulpit creep who only wants to lead a nice life and make a name for himself. At the same time, when I think of other popes, then I must say that different ones among them at least still believed in what they said, while this pope is only pretending. And then Billy goes on to say, although he is a damn bad actor. And Quetzal comments that you are approximately correct. And Quetzal goes on to say that the Pope is actually a criminal. And he talks about, they also in their conversation here talk about the Falkland Islands in Argentina. There was a war called the Falkland Island War, which is a very important war, which I think we'll have to get into in a little more detail. Maybe I can try to make some clips on the Falkland Island War. It's really fascinating. It involved Argentina and England. So let me read this now. Besides this, he will also strive to arrive in Argentina in order to break in on the population with his dishonest manner regarding the war between Argentina and England. During the month of April 1982, the Argentinians will militarily garrison the Falkland Islands, which are under the English colony, whereupon England will send out a fleet through which a veritable guerrilla war will emerge between both countries, which will demand many human lives and war material. The English had several ships off the coast of Argentina, several aircraft carriers, and they had what was called the Harrier jump jet, which is the first jet that would take off vertically from a carrier. And the Harriers were pretty maneuverable, and they shot down a lot of the Argentinian planes. And the Harriers also bombed certain places on the Argentinian coast there. Now listen to what this says, and this is part of the intersection between the Goblet of Truth. It says, well, let me read this first. During the month of April 1982, the Argentinians will militarily garrison the Falkland Islands, which are under the English colony, whereupon England will send out a fleet through which a veritable guerrilla war will emerge between both nations, which will demand many human lives and war material. And I just read that. This war will be a sign of the threatening Third World conflagration in the new millennium, in the third millennium. You know, we're in the third millennium now. Remember, Thoth told Billy that the third millennium would begin when we dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the Goblet of Truth tells us that in the third millennium, that our leaders will become megalomaniacal. They will take away our rights of self-determination, and that the people will become indolent, obtuse, indifferent, and this will create a circumstance where people will become very angry. And we're seeing today that anger come forth in the Ferguson riots, which are taking place probably still tonight, since the verdict came out and the policeman is considered innocent now. People are looting stores and setting police cruisers on fire and other cars on fire, and Ferguson's a mess. There's a huge riot going on in Mexico City that happened today. Another huge riot in another city in Mexico because there's huge corruption in the Mexican government, and the president and his wife are working directly with some kind of organized criminal group that has been killing Mexican students, and the Mexicans figured it out, and they know that's the truth now. I don't know how many students have been killed and for what reasons, I don't know. But there's horrible riots going on right now, both in the United States and Mexico, and this is part of the third millennium. And this leads into this third world conflagration. Moreover, this will also be the actual fundamental point for the fact that is in this world war. If it cannot be prevented, England will come under attack from the east with great power, but there still lies in the far future. And if it should get so far, then nobody will search for the grounds for the attack on England in this forthcoming Falkland conflict. And they predicted here that it will erupt on the month of April of 1982. And Billy comments on the Prime Minister Thatcher of Britain. He calls her a bratty girl. And he says that she actually needs a good spanking, which I found kind of interesting. And this was something that kind of shocked me, amazed me a little bit. Billy said that altogether they are truly not at all adults, but rather rascally boys and girls, even snotty-nosed little boys and girls. Now he's talking about the leaders here on our planet, and Quetzal says, "Your dialect expressions are very appropriate. There's not a single mature person among them, as is the case with most of the other rulers of the earth." Wow, no wonder we're in such a mess. Billy says, finally, an open word relating to this. And those who would actually be somewhat suited as executive personnel are not man enough to enforce what is right because they do not dare to defend themselves against the party comrades, perhaps because they fear for their posts. Anyway. Sorry about the phone ringing in the background. This is live radio. We actually have a whole bunch of people here, too. You could probably hear them speaking in the background. The difficulty I go through trying to bring this information to you. Anyway. Contact Report 150 is fascinating. I suggest you find it on the Future Mankind site, print it out, read it for yourself, and be as amazed as I am. Well, maybe it's a good time to shift back to the Goblet of Truth. Billy does go on to talk about one of the leaders in Israel, Menachem Begin. I think he was one of the leaders of Israel, as a matter of fact, during that time. Has some really negative things to say about him, which we will definitely, I'll try to get into that in the future. By the way, I have several days free here. Since we are in Thanksgiving time, I've got some time off work. I'm going to try to do steady shows on this material and continue. In light that we are discussing bodies in space like Saturn and the Voyager, I think I'll play just a very, very short bit of this clip about spiral galaxies, and I'll go grab my notes on the Goblet of Truth, and we'll continue the show here.
The NASA ESA Hubble Space Telescope, with a little help from an amateur astronomer, has produced one of the best views yet of nearby galaxy Messier 106, a striking spiral galaxy with a number of secrets. Located a little over 20 million light-years away, practically a neighbor by cosmic standards, Messier 106 is one of the brightest and nearest spiral galaxies to our Milky Way. Although it may not look particularly unique, some of its features have baffled astronomers for years. Messier 106 has a supermassive black hole at its center. Although this is true for most galaxies, this black hole is particularly active and hungry, gobbling up nearby material at a startling rate. This huge black hole's bottomless appetite is behind much of the galaxy's unusual behavior. Messier 106 appears to be emitting powerful radiation from its center, something we do not see with our Milky Way. This is caused by the very active black hole at the galaxy's center, which violently drags gas and dust inwards. This material heats up, emitting bright microwave and X-ray radiation as it does so.
Spiral Galaxy with a Secret. You can look that up on YouTube. All these clips are pulled off of YouTube and converted into MP3s. Billy has a book. It's called The Goblet of Truth. I think it was written around 2008, 2007. It has close to 575 pages in it or something to that effect. My entry point into this book is this paragraph that I repeat and repeat and repeat. It's entitled What the Truth Knows to Say. It says, rivers, lakes, streams, bushes, trees, the air and water, everything that crawls and flies on the earth is a life form with a spirit form. And these spirit forms are on a journey through time, which involves many, many lifetimes, and that death is just the passage to rebirth into the world of pure spirit. And many of these creatures are connected by psychic vibrations, and they communicate with one another. And if you go into the forest, you can hear the communications. You can hear the crickets and the cicadas and the frogs and the crickets and the birds as they sing. I like to think that the birds sing because in some small way they also sense the radiating love of creation. You see, creation is the universal consciousness. It's the superintelligence which permeates our entire universe. It's a neutral positive entity. It builds universes as a part of its own evolution, and it evolves. The predominant principle in the universe is love. Love is the highest principle in creation, and everything follows that principle in absolute logic. And every tiny plant and every tiny animal in creation fulfills its purpose in creation. In fact, the indescribable splendor of nature is the visible expression of the love of creation. Now, this universal consciousness is a mysterious and fascinating living being. It has no personality. It doesn't exhibit any of the attributes that are sometimes ascribed to it. It doesn't become jealous or angry. It's not human-like. It's much more like air or water, if you want to just try to think of it that way. It's a pure being of energy. It's a spiritual intelligence. In the German, it's called a Wesenheiten. It radiates love, but I think it's safe to say it doesn't personally love us. It radiates love the same way the sun radiates heat and radiates light. Now, one of the beautiful things about nature is it's a tightly woven web. Billy describes it as a tightly woven web. Now, when something is woven, as in fabric, the fibers are interlaced one with the other. like material, like thread, like yarn. Nature is interconnected like that. And in nature, we see repeating patterns throughout nature. You'll see the repeating patterns that appear on the branches of a tree in the way it grows. Have you noticed the branching structure on a tree? It's very similar to the branching structure that forms during a lightning strike. Repeating patterns, because there's the same intelligence behind it all. A repeating branching structure in your circulatory system. So if you look at the microcosm, the small, very small, or the very large, you'll see the repeating patterns of nature. Billy's third teacher, Semyase, said everything is within the human. It's the microcosm within the macrocosm. So the Maya material teaches respect and venerability towards nature. Venerability is a deep appreciation for the impressive dignity and age of something. And we should have a deep appreciation for nature, for our planet, for the tightly woven web of life. It's indissoluble. Now, our civilization, unfortunately, has taken a wrong turn in evolution. In fact, it was induced. There was an intelligence on the earth in the ancient past after the fall of Atlantis and Lemuria. This intelligence is called the Giza intelligence in the Maya material. And after the fall of Atlantis and Lemuria particularly, they deceived the people of the earth with religions, and they sent us down a wrong path of evolution. So our society is what's called an aberration. An aberration is something that has evolved in the wrong or incorrect way. In my mind, I think of it almost as a deformity. And because we're an aberration, we now have grown all sorts of strange things. Fanatical religions, for example. A fanatic is someone that has a lot of zeal, but he has no critical thinking about himself. We have stubborn nationalism. We have fascism. Fascism is a governmental system that's led by a dictator, having complete power, forcibly suppressing opposition and criticism. Doesn't that describe our country today? Now, as I said before, an aberration is the act of departing from right, normal, and usual course. So all of these, the religions, the fascism, even our neo-capitalism, is departing from what is right, and it's an immense threat to the people of the earth, and we are heading towards this extremely large-scale disaster. We see the war in Ukraine, we see the riots in Mexico, we see the riots in St. Louis and Ferguson. Everything is moving towards a climax. Cynical materialism, unbridled neo-capitalism which have now overtaken the entire world, are already leading to extremely serious damage to nature. We have desecrated nature. We are destroying nature. Everywhere, we're destroying nature. And there is serious damage to nature. Not only that, there is damage to the morality of human beings on Earth. And it also goes hand in hand with our overpopulation. Now, we have many cynics today, people that are motivated by self-interest. They're distrustful of human dignity and sincerity, and there are many materialists being born. Materialism is a tendency to consider material possessions and physical comfort as more important than spiritual values. So we're a society that's gone down the wrong path, and it's going to be a while before we get back on the right path. I do have a clip on what's going on in Mexico, if I can find it. And it starts out quite interesting because it talks about, I've discussed it before, our leaders are becoming megalomaniacal, and we have billionaires all over. There are growing numbers of billionaires all over the earth, and we're having a big problem with economies around the world, but the billionaires are getting richer. In Mexico, we have state-sponsored massacres that are taking place. That's why there's all these riots, and there's a second Snowden that is appearing. Let me play this clip. It's rather long, and I think I'll just let it play for a while.
What's happening, folks? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. So remember how after the global financial crisis, we were supposed to reform an out-of-control banking system that thrived on lining the pockets of the 1% at the expense of the rest of us? Well, apparently the world's billionaires didn't get the memo. See, according to a report just released by Oxfam International, since the crisis, quote, ended in 2009, the number of billionaires has actually doubled. That's right. In 2009, there were 793 billionaires worldwide. As of March of this year, that number now stands at 1,645. So wealth inequality must be decreasing if so many more people are entering the rarefied space occupied by the Kochs and Soroses of the world. Not so much. The report also found that billionaire wealth has only become more concentrated, increasing by a combined 120% over that same time period. And the timing of the report is quite interesting because just days earlier, UNICEF found that child poverty has increased in over 20 developed countries since the global recession. But I'm sure there's no connection between the two. Now let's break the set.
Speculation has been replacing hard fact. Terrorists don't read Twitter.
Who's right and who's wrong?
It was a terrible thing to say, period.
The mistake entirely on me.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. These words are hard hitting, you watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set.
When it comes to the corporate media's coverage of stories south of the border, it seems like every news piece is reduced to a superficial debate over the immigration crisis. But what's almost never discussed is the rampant corruption that has infected local governments across Mexico, leading to the brutal suppression and use of mass violence against civilian populations. Over the course of the last few months, we've seen every part of the stark reality played out in the southern Mexican city of Iguala. See, back in September, 43 students from a teacher's college went missing after they were viciously attacked by local police during a protest against discriminatory hiring practices, leaving 6 people dead. In the days and weeks following, at least 12 mass burial graves were discovered near the city, filled with the charred and dismembered remains of dozens of bodies, leading Iguala residents to fear the worst about the fate of these young students. However, according to Mexican officials, the DNA of these particular bodies did not match the students, highlighting just how prevalent mass murder really is in this part of the country. And just this week, yet another mass grave was uncovered about 10 miles from where the students were last seen, reigniting a nightmare scenario all over again. But as disturbing as these findings are, an even more insidious fact lurks beneath the surface of the investigation: that virtually the entire government of Iguala was directly responsible for the disappearance of these students. See, based on interviews with dozens of witnesses, investigators allege that after the students were attacked by the cops, they were handed over to members of one of Mexico's deadliest drug cartels, Los Guerros Unidos. And this is hardly a case of just a few rogue, compromised officers. In fact, all the evidence points directly to the former mayor of Iguala, Jose Abarca, and his wife, Maria Pineda, as being the masterminds behind this sick plot. Members of Guerros Unidos have now admitted that at least 30 Iguala police officers were working directly for the cartel under the leadership of Abarca and Pineda, and that they've acted as the couple's personal hitmen. And while 56 people have been arrested in connection to this potential mass murder, Abarca and Pineda have been missing for weeks and are now considered fugitives. Now, the motive for such a despicable act is still not entirely clear, but the most logical explanation is that the student protests disrupted a campaign event that Pineda was holding on the same day to launch her own bid for mayor. Of course, throughout the course of these events, federal authorities have distanced themselves as far as possible from the Iguala government, all along feigning shock at what transpired there. But average Mexicans know better than to trust those in Mexico City have no idea what was going on in a town just 100 miles away. According to a senator from Abarca's own political party, quote, everyone knew about their presumed connections to organized crime. Nobody did anything. Not the federal government, not the state government, not the party leadership. See, these disappearances are just the latest to hit Mexico during the war on drugs. In fact, according to the Mexican government's own figures, over the course of the last 8 years, a stunning 20,000 people have gone missing. This, on top of the 60,000 people that have been killed in connection to the drug war just between the years 2006 and 2012. All the while, billions of dollars continue to be funneled into Mexico from the U.S. as part of the Merida initiative. In theory, this money is supposed to be used to eliminate the most violent criminal gangs on earth. But instead, there's almost no oversight of where money and arms end up, or whether this foreign aid is funding and supplying the very entities that are supposed to be dismantled. Not to mention the DEA's explicit protection of the Sinaloa cartel, the biggest drug cartel in the world, in exchange for information about rival cartels, according to an investigation by Mexican newspaper El Universal. However, even though this approach has been an abysmal failure, and corruption and utter disregard for human life within the Mexican government can be tracked to the highest levels, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. The disappearance of these students might just be the catalyst for real grassroots action among Mexico's youth and working class. Last week, tens of thousands of young people marched across the country in solidarity with the students. In Mexico City alone, 50,000 people filled Zocalo Square, demanding that the investigation into the students' disappearance be taken out of the hands of the federal government and transferred to a local people's committee. Hopefully, these demonstrations are just the beginning of a much larger movement that will finally serve as a warning for Mexico's political brass that this insane level of corruption, murder, and betrayal can no longer be tolerated. But hey, I guess talking about how high of a wall to build on the border is a far more important discussion. This week it came to light that the FBI recently raided the home of an unidentified government contractor in Northern Virginia, who's been coined the second Snowden. Officials suspect that he or she is the source of the August 5th leak of classified documents that expose the shocking length of the government's no-fly list. So, who is this mysterious figure, and will we see the government prosecute yet another whistleblower in the months to come? Joining me now to discuss the case is RT correspondent Marina Portnaya. Amazing to have you in studio, Marina.
Thanks for having me, Abby.
So, I know that we don't know much, obviously, but what do we know about the leaker so far, if anything? And explain the August 5th release. What exactly was that leak that he or she released?
Well, according to reports, this leaker is an employee of a federal contracting firm that allegedly handed over sensitive documents to journalists at The Intercept about the government's terror watch list. As you mentioned in your introduction, back in August, journalists Jeremy Scahill and Ryan Devereaux published a story showing that at least half of the people listed in the U.S. government's terrorist screening database had no recognized terrorist group affiliation. It's important to note that 680,000 people are listed in that database. So imagine half of them, no affiliation, no terrorist affiliation. What they also disclosed is that New York City, Dearborn, Michigan were among the cities that had the most people listed on the database. Dearborn, Michigan, their population is 40% Arab. So, of course, this bombshell of a story prompted a lot of questions about how the U.S. government's programs are using ethnic and racial mapping to identify alleged terrorist suspects. But it also, raised questions about how many innocent people, hundreds of thousands of them, are being deemed suspected terrorists when they have no reason to be considered suspected terrorists.
It was a really, really bombshell report, and I remember Greenwald kind of coming out and saying, yes, this does, there is obviously a second leaker because Snowden's already kind of released the trove. What I want to know is, I wonder, if he or she has leaked anything else that we'll see coming up. But of course, as we just mentioned, the FBI has raided allegedly the home of this leaker. I wanted to kind of segue over to Yahoo News report that a source at the Justice Department claims that the agency, quote, may now be more reluctant to bring criminal charges involving unauthorized disclosures to the news media. I feel like, he could just be blowing smoke here. Considering the trend so far, how do you think that this new leaker will impact the way that the president will basically prosecute in the future?
Well, look, the president, Barack Obama, and his administration are really under fire for prosecuting already 7 whistleblowers under the Espionage Act. Edward Snowden is still facing espionage charges despite all of the people that are calling for his clemency. So Obama's anti-leak efforts and his aggressive tactics against whistleblowers has faced blowback, if you will. So maybe the White House may not want to start another PR debacle for themselves, especially if this current whistleblower, this leaker that we're talking about, is leaking information in the public's interest, because that's something the Espionage Act does not even take into consideration, that if the information is in the public's interest, maybe that person should not be prosecuted and jailed.
Right, and we're talking about a Cold War, or no, not even Cold War, World War I piece of legislation that was basically about prosecuting spies. Here we are in 2014, where it's just, journalists being swept under the rug, like Assange potentially getting charged with that. It's ridiculous. And of course you have, while Snowden and these people are being painted as criminals, traitors, the very article that revealed the FBI investigation of the second leaker was full of unnamed government sources who asked not to be identified. It's hilarious, especially when you see Eli Lake, Josh Rogan basically being awarded for being stenographers. All they do is cite anonymous government sources. What is the difference here? It's just to make them look good, I guess, is when they don't care.
Well, the difference is when you see publications and journalists citing sources, it's usually government officials who want that story planted. They want that story revealed and released. But they do not want whistleblowers and leakers like Edward Snowden leaking information that would benefit the public to know. So it's about them controlling the story. Sources are usually the ones controlling the story. The White House wants that leaked. But then if it's a whistleblower, a leaker that wants the public to know what's happening, then those are the people that are vilified.
Right, and of course the DOD just released a new directive to combat the leaks, saying that leaks will now be called serious security incidents. It just seems like this is just a really big new strategy here to kind of launch a new assault on whoever this leaker is. We have about 30 minutes.
Okay, I think it's just semantics. That's all it is. They created a phrase that makes it feel like if something is leaked, then it violates or it puts national security interests at risk. And that's all it is.
Yep. Well, Obama's the king of rhetoric, so I guess it's par for the course here. Thanks so much, Marina Portnaya. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Coming up, some of the most censored stories of the year. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss it.
You know that guy who wishes someone would spy on him? How about the woman who enjoys being lied to by her government? This citizen can't get enough congressional inaction, and this taxpayer wants the mainstream media to be more corporatized. While this person would rather eat genetically modified food, this one thinks our prisons are not crowded enough. And what do these people have in common? They don't exist.
Most people think to stand out in this business, you need to be the first one on top of the story, or the person with the loudest voice, or the biggest ratings. In truth, to stand out in the news business, you just need to ask the right questions and demand the right answers. Question more.
90% of American news is filtered through only 6 monolithic corporations, which means that many people are missing out on the biggest, most important stories that most affect them and the planet. Luckily, we have Project Censored, a research-based organization that embodies everything journalism should be. Among many other services, the group highlights the year's top 25 most censored stories in its annual book, a book that gives an incredibly detailed analysis on power structures and the oppressive media landscapes that stifle the news we truly need. Well, earlier I was joined by the director of Project Censored, Nikki Huff, where we talked about just 5 of the stories covered in the book, Censored 2015, Inspiring We the People. I first asked him about a censored story concerning a historic lawsuit that challenges the nuclear power industry's immunity from nuclear liability.
A lot of people don't realize Tokyo Electric Power Company, or TEPCO, right? I mean that's the major company that was responsible for a lot of the failures at Fukushima. But also Toshiba, Hitachi, and General Electric and their Mark I reactors. They are prone to dangerous gas buildups, and we're using them, in fact, here in the United States even. And since 1972, these reactors have been considered safety risks because of hydrogen gas buildup. And there are close to 1,500 plaintiffs, including 38 residents of Fukushima, 357 people from outside Japan. I mean, again, this is a major issue, trying to hold accountable the nuclear power industry. There is another suit, by the way, by U.S. Navy personnel who were on the USS Ronald Reagan that were exposed to radiation. Some of those people are sick and near death at this point. We covered that story on the Project Censored radio show, and then it was subsequently picked up, thankfully, by Amy Goodman and people at Democracy Now! But most people aren't paying any attention to this, and I have to say, another one of the big problems in these cases is that most people in the United States don't seem to pay a lot of attention to them unless they involve Americans. And people in Japan are really on the front line of this. And again, TEPCO's dumping hundreds of tons of radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean daily. We're going to be covering another major Fukushima show here in a couple of weeks. And again, it's an ongoing nightmare. When you turn on corporate media, all you hear is Ebola, 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 Ebola. Ebola might be a big problem for some people in Western African countries, but it's not really a problem in the United States. The dangers we face from nuclear fallout, nuclear radiation, are actually far greater, particularly in California, where we have major nuclear power plants on fault lines.
And of course, GE, you mentioned how they're exacerbating the problem. GE, who do they own? Major news networks here in the U.S. Unbelievable. Let's move on to the Cato Institute, who cited that Americans are 8 times more likely to be killed by a police officer than a terrorist. Mickey, that number, might be even higher, because the 18th most censored story of the year is the fact that there's no federal database citing the amount of police killings per year in the U.S. America has some of the most trigger-happy cops in the country. Why do you think this doesn't exist, and what's being done to fill the void and provide that data?
Well, D. Brian Berghardt is an editor of the Reno News Review. He's a journalism instructor at the University of Nevada. He actually decided to create a public database this year because the FBI may track how many police officers...
This is a little off track, technically speaking, from Contact Report 150, and even off track slightly from the Goblet of Truth, but I think it illustrates what the Meyer material says about what's going to happen in the third millennium, and it also illustrates some of the corruption and chaos that must have taken place during the time of Atlantis and Lemuria, which I haven't gotten around to talk about too much this evening. But I wanted to stop on this subject of Fukushima. That long clip that I played was from Russia Today, which is a pretty good source of information. If you look on YouTube for billionaires doubling Mexico, state-sponsored massacres, and the second Snowden all in one title, you might be able to find that, and you can see the actual film for yourself. But I wanted to talk about Fukushima and read a little bit from Contact Report 517. And here Billy says, it is because of the seaquake tsunami catastrophe in Japan. Around 6:45 a.m. Central European Time on Friday, the 11th of March, a massive earthquake with a strength of 9.0 on the Richter scale occurred off the Japanese coast. The earthquake triggered an enormous tsunami which rolled across the coast of the main island of Honshu. The worst affected are three prefectures in the northeast of the country: Fukushima, Iwate, and Miyagi, on a 600-kilometer coastline. In Fukushima, a nuclear plant with 6 reactors has been seriously affected. In regard to that, it is said that a super worst possible case scenario is possible. But I think this has already happened, and that now an ultra super worst possible case scenario threatens. And it is also the case that the emerging radiation and radioactive water from the reactors will not just pollute large parts of the district, rather perhaps entire tracts of land and the sea. And the emerging radioactive particles will also be driven by the wind around the world, also to Europe. And this is what Ptah says. Ptah is an Ishwish. He's the commander of the Plarion mothership. He says, your assumption is right, that the so-called super worst case scenario has already occurred, being that very dangerous and extensive radiation is being emitted from reactor 3, in which the dangerous plutonium is exposed, and which not only spreads over wide regions, rather also spreads out into the sea and seriously contaminates the sea as well as fish and other creatures, which has manifold deadly consequences. It is therefore a deliberate lie from those in charge that disaster has not yet happened in the named form. And the occurrence of the now threatening ultra super worst possible case scenario, as you call it, is only a question of time. The measures which are taken for the cooling of the reactors and so forth, which are meant to prevent everything, only correspond to useless acts of desperation. But also bear in mind, with this, is that the water which is taken in desperation from the sea to use for cooling, on the other hand, involves great danger because the seawater's salt generates dangerous effects which impair the cooling process. And the radioactive particles, which are blown all over the place by the wind, actually spread around the Earth. We have already been able to detect 2 days ago, on March 7, 2011, therefore the last Thursday, such radioactive particles in the northern area of Europe as well in Central Europe. And Billy asks, and is Switzerland affected by that? Ptah. That is actually the case, whereby one can assume that the radioactive particles which have emerged up to this point in low amounts will manifest in increased quantity. So we have a very dangerous set of affairs that are going on now during the third millennium, as it's called in the Meyer material. I have just about 5 minutes left in the show. I want to play a little bit of a quick clip here that also talks about overpopulation.
Okay, well, let's start at the obvious point. It's the 7 billion. The fact that we've got this far without collapsing in a heap, is this a day for you, a day of celebration or despair?
It's not a day of despair, because I knew it was coming. But of course, all of my colleagues, everybody you can count, realizes we're in deep trouble, and have 1 billion people almost hungry, 2 or 3 billion living on $2 a day, and we're wrecking our environment, particularly our climate, on which our agriculture depends. In the United States right now, peanut butter is going up 1/3 in price because of the beginnings of climate disruption. Texas burned down, and many poor people are going to be in trouble because peanut butter is a staple for them. So it's certainly no cause for celebration. It's a cause for thought and organization, and we're not getting any of either in either of our nations.
Is there anything to hearten you, the fact that we have got to 7 billion and we're not in a state of chaos?
You think we're not in a state of chaos? You're putting me on. No. There's some heartening things. One is that around the world, we have managed to improve the condition of women and bring birth rates down in many places. And the most heartening thing is that some of the most overpopulated nations, like those of Europe, are starting to shrink. Unfortunately, our most overpopulated nation, the United States, is still growing like a rocket. But that's small heartening when you consider what we're doing to our life support systems, and that's really the sad thing.
With the emergence of technology, it's given us a lot more options in terms of food production. Does that mean that as we head to the next billion people, that it's going to be less of an environmental footprint than the previous billion?
I think a lot of people don't understand that the next 2 billion, which are scheduled if we don't have a huge die-off to be with us in 2045, will do much more damage than the last 2 billion. And the reason is people are smart. We picked the low-hanging fruit first. All the people we get in the future are going to have to be fed from more and more marginal land with resources that are taken from poorer and poorer supplies and require more and more energy to extract them. And agriculture is one of the big contributors of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And we are now seeing, we're entrained about 1,000 years of continual change in precipitation patterns, which means we're going to have to not only revise the entire energy infrastructure of the planet over the next few decades, we're going to have to also change the water handling infrastructure, something that's very familiar to Australians. And that's a gigantic job if we're going to manage to continue to increase the food production that we need to increase if we're going to feed the additional people.
Well, to complicate all this, the Ogallala aquifer is being depleted. The Ogallala aquifers in the central United States, it's really what allowed us to, one of the great giant aquifers that allowed us to become the breadbasket for the world. It's gone down from an average depth of 600 feet an average depth of like 240 feet to about 80 feet. It's completely dried up in some areas. So it's going to be very shortly too expensive to try to get water from this area. Too expensive to actually produce the food for these other 2 billion people that are going to be on the earth. Well, I think it's been an interesting show this evening. I plan on being back tomorrow, and we're going to continue on this fascinating information in Contact Report 150 in the Goblet of Truth. And hopefully we'll get back to Atlantis and Lemuria a little bit, because all of these disasters have occurred in the past. Have a good evening. Thanks for listening.